There was a swamp behind the Callahan place that nobody wanted. Cattails up to your waist. Mud that pulled the boot right off your foot if you weren't careful. Mosquitoes so thick in July that the neighbors joked you needed a raincoat just to stand still. Ruth was 8 years old the first time her grandfather took her there. Every other Saturday morning, the men in that part of Iowa walked their cornfields. Rows straight as rulers, green and proud, and easy to love. Everett Callahan walked past all of it. Past the barn, past the fence line, down through the low ground where the corn wouldn't grow, to the place everybody else called wasted. "Grandpa, why do we always come here?" He didn't answer right away. He knelt down at the edge of the water, took her small hand, and pushed it gently into the mud until she felt the cold water close around her fingers. "Every place people call useless," he said, "is usually busy doing work they can't see." She laughed at that. 8-year-olds laugh at most things they don't understand yet. She pulled her hand out, wiped it on her jeans, and ran back toward the house, already thinking about breakfast. She didn't think about that sentence again for almost 30 years. Everett died the winter she turned 26. The farm passed to her mother, and years after that, when her mother's hands grew too unsteady to sign checks, it passed to Ruth. By then the swamp was still there, still ignored, still mocked at every county, gathering within earshot of a Callahan. At a township meeting one spring evening, the county rolled out a drainage proposal. Bigger ditches, straighter tile lines, 300 more tillable acres across the district if everyone signed on. Every hand in the room went up when the vote came around the table, except one. A ripple of laughter moved through the folding chairs when Ruth said no. Somebody in the back muttered something about mosquitoes. Somebody else offered, only half joking, to buy her a canoe for harvest. 3 months later, the largest flood in decades tore through that county, and the same people who laughed that night were the ones knocking on Ruth Callahan's door. Ruth Callahan was 39 the year the drainage vote came up, though most people in town would have guessed older by the way she carried herself. She wasn't a woman who raised her voice. She let silence do most of her arguing for her, which in a room full of men who liked the sound of their own opinions came across as strange, sometimes even rude. She'd buried a husband 6 years earlier in a tractor accident. Nobody liked to bring up, and she was caring for her mother now in the same farmhouse where she'd grown up, the same farmhouse where her grandfather used to hang his mud-caked boots by the back door every evening without fail. The rest of the township had moved on from that kind of farming a long time ago. Bigger equipment, straighter fields. Every wet corner tiled and drained and folded into the row crop like it had never existed. The Hendricks operation 2 miles east had tripled in size over 15 years doing exactly that, and Wayne Hendricks wasn't shy about saying so. "You've got 20 wasted acres back there, Ruth," he told her once, leaning against his truck at the elevator. "That's easy 40. 50,000 a year in corn you're just letting sit in the mud." "It's not sitting," she said. "It's working." Wayne laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at somebody you genuinely like, but think is a little lost. "Working on what? Growing cattails?" He wasn't a villain, not by the standards anybody in that county would use. He'd inherited debt, not land, and built something real out of grinding effort and government-backed loans and every acre he could get his hands on. He believed honestly and without malice that dirt that didn't grow a cash crop was dirt going to waste. It was the only kind of math he'd ever been taught. Ruth's 20 acres told a different story if anybody cared to listen. That low ground behind the barn filled every spring with runoff from 3 directions, held it, let it soak down slow instead of racing off toward the creek. Frogs sang there in April loud enough to hear from the porch. Ducks nested in the cattails by May. Old-timers used to call ground like that a sponge, though nobody under 60 used that word anymore. None of that mattered much to the county engineer, who showed up that August with a clipboard and a survey crew, walking the boundary lines for a new drainage district that would connect nearly every farm in the township into one long system of tile and ditch, emptying straight into Miller's Creek. Every landowner along the route signed, except Ruth. At the meeting where the final vote came down, she sat near the back and said no when her name was called, calm as anything, and the room did what rooms like that do. Somebody chuckled. Somebody said something about mosquitoes loud enough for her to hear. Wayne didn't laugh, but he didn't defend her either, and by the time the meeting broke up, word had already spread that the Callahan woman was going to keep her swamp out of pure stubbornness, and everybody had better things to do than argue her out of it. The survey stakes went in that fall along every property line but hers. Winter is when a farm's finances catch up with a person, and that winter caught up with Ruth harder than most. A combine belt failure in October had cost more than she'd budgeted. Her mother's medication had gone up twice. The bank in town, the same bank that had financed 3 generations of Callahan crops, sent a letter in January asking her to come in and discuss her operating loan. The loan officer, a younger man named Curtis, who'd grown up 2 townships over, wasn't unkind about it, but he wasn't shy either. Every other farm your size in this district picked up acreage this year, he said, sliding a spreadsheet across the desk. You're the only one who didn't. I didn't need to drain wetland to stay solvent. With respect, Ruth, the numbers don't care what you needed. She left that meeting with an extension on the loan and a knot in her stomach that didn't loosen for weeks. Her cousin called that same month to ask, not unkindly, whether she'd thought about just letting Wayne rent the low ground and be done with it. Even her mother, on a clear-headed evening in February, asked her quietly why she was making things so hard on herself over a patch of mud her father used to complain about, too. For the first time since the vote, Ruth wondered if everyone else might simply be right. She kept the marsh anyway, mostly because pulling it out from under her grandfather's memory felt like a betrayal she couldn't quite name, and partly because some stubborn part of her still believed there was a reason he'd walked her out there every Saturday instead of through the corn. Spring came back, regardless of anybody's opinion on the matter. The ducks returned to the cattails in the last week of March, right on schedule, the way they had every year Ruth could remember. Her mother sat on the porch one evening in April with the windows open and said, out of nowhere, that the marsh sounded alive tonight, and for a moment the 2 of them just sat and listened to the frogs without saying anything else. Wayne complained about the frog noise carrying across the property line one evening at the co-op. Ruth told him with a straight face that they paid better rent than some tenants he'd had. A few of the men standing around laughed at that one, actually laughed with her instead of at her, which was the first time that had happened in longer than she wanted to admit. It was around that same time that the county extension office put out a bulletin most farmers skimmed and forgot about wetland loss across the Midwest over the past century, and how communities from Iowa to Manitoba to parts of England had been dealing with heavier, faster floods as natural floodplains disappeared under tile and concrete. Ruth read the whole thing twice. It didn't change anything about her finances. It just made her feel a little less alone in a decision most of her neighbors thought was foolish. By June, the new drainage district was fully operational, ditches humming with runoff every time it rained, fields drying out faster than anyone in that township had ever seen them dry. Then the forecast changed. The National Weather Service issued its first advisory in the last week of June, calling for an unusually wet system stalling over the upper Midwest for the better part of 2 weeks. Nobody at the elevator seemed particularly worried. Wet Junes happened. The new drainage system would handle it, same as it handled every rain since March. Ruth read the forecast twice, looked out toward the marsh, and didn't say anything to anyone. It started as an ordinary rain on a Tuesday and hadn't let up by the following Monday. Miller's Creek came up out of its banks on day 4. By day 6, county roads were closing one after another, orange barricades appearing faster than the highway department could keep track of them. The school district canceled summer programs. The volunteer fire department started running water rescue, drills they hadn't needed since 1993. Dale Kruger, who drove the district's grain truck route for 30 years before retiring, said later he'd never seen the creek move like that, brown and fast and carrying whole fence sections downstream like they were nothing. The new drainage system did exactly what it was built to do. Every ditch, every tile line, every acre of newly drained ground across the township funneled its water into Miller's Creek at once, fast and efficient, precisely the way the engineers had designed it. For the first 2 days it looked like a triumph. The Hendricks fields and every field connected to that system drained clean and dry while water pooled in low spots elsewhere. Then the creek couldn't hold what it was being handed. With nowhere left to spread naturally, the water that used to soak slowly into wetland ground now arrived, downstream all at once, and downstream was where most of the township lived. The creek jumped its banks 2 miles below the Hendricks place on day 5 and kept climbing. Ruth's 20 acres told a different story that week. The marsh behind her barn began filling the way it filled every spring, only slower, wider, more deliberate than anyone watching had ever bothered to notice before. Water crept up through the cattails an inch at a time, spreading out across ground that had nothing built on it, nothing planted in it, nothing to lose. It looked, if you stood at the fence line and watched long enough, like the land breathing in. Ruth stood there on the 4th evening of rain with her grandfather's old walking stick, the one that had hung on a nail by the back door for as long as she could remember, and finally understood what he'd meant 30 years earlier, with her hand pressed into the mud. "I finally understand," she said to no one, and went back inside before the rain could soak through her coat again. 2 counties over, a levee gave way along a different stretch of creek that night, and word spread through the township radio that everyone downstream needed to be ready to move on short notice. "Can I ask you something? Think about one place from your own childhood that everybody called useless. A creek nobody swam in, an old tree nobody climbed, a muddy field at the edge of somebody's property that never grew a thing worth mentioning. It's funny how often the places we overlook end up protecting us in ways we never notice at the time. If this story brings one of those places back to your mind, leave a like and tell us about it in the comments. I genuinely like to read those. Now let's see what happened when the flood reached the rest of the county. By the 7th day, the flood had reached its worst point across the township. Grain bins on 3 separate farms buckled under the weight of standing water. The Hendricks operation evacuated its cattle to higher ground at 2 in the morning, headlights and flashlights, cutting through the rain as neighbors, who hadn't spoken in months, worked side by side, moving animals through knee-deep water. Roads that had existed for 100 years simply stopped being roads, swallowed under brown water that showed no sign of receding. Ruth's farm told a different story from everyone else's that week. The marsh overflowing exactly the way it had been built to overflow long before anyone thought to call it that, spread the floodwater out across acres of reeds and cattails, instead of letting it race toward the buildings. The barn stayed dry. The house stayed dry. The cattle she kept on the higher pasture never had to move. Where every other farm along Miller's Creek measured its losses in tens of thousands of dollars, Ruth measured hers in nothing worse than a wet fence line and a flooded access road. The county engineer who'd walked her property with a clipboard the previous August came back, and a pair of borrowed waders to take measurements he clearly hadn't expected to take. He stood at the edge of the marsh for a long time before he said anything. "This shouldn't be possible," he said finally. "Every other property on this creek is under water. This one's barely wet. Ruth didn't say I told you so, though she'd earned the right to." She just pointed toward the cattails. "It's not magic. It's just doing what it's always done." Nobody was watching. Wayne Hendricks drove over 3 days later, once the water had dropped enough for a truck to make it down her lane. He stood at the fence for a long moment before he spoke, looking out at ground that had cost him nothing and saved him everything he still had left. "I thought I was improving my land," he said quietly. "Turns out I took out the thing that was protecting it." It wasn't an easy thing for a man like Wayne to say out loud, and Ruth didn't make him say more than that. A week later, standing at the same fence line, he asked her, half smiling for the first time and longer than either of them could remember, whether she was still keeping her mosquito farm. "Thinking about expanding it," she said, and meant it. The flood made the regional news for exactly one cycle before the country's attention moved elsewhere, the way it always does. But within the township, something had shifted that wouldn't move on so easily. A team from the state university came out that fall to study Ruth's 20 acres, measuring water absorption rates and comparing them against the drained fields around it. Their numbers matched what the county engineer had already seen with his own eyes. Land like Ruth's had held back an amount of water that, multiplied across even a fraction of the drained acreage in the township, would have kept the worst of the flooding off 6 farms. Local school children toured the marsh that October, boots sinking into ground their grandparents had once been paid to drain. A conservation group approached Ruth about a wetland easement, offering to help fund restoration work on similar ground across the county, starting, if she was willing, with a few acres on the Hendricks place. Wayne signed the paperwork himself. Ruth never made a habit of reminding anyone what she'd said at that township meeting the year before. When people asked her about it, and plenty did, she gave them the same answer every time, the one her grandfather had given her 3 decades earlier without her fully understanding it. "We don't own this land," she'd say. "We just borrow it for a while." By the following spring, 3 other farms along Miller's Creek had begun restoring low ground they drained years earlier, not out of sentiment, but because the flood had made the math finally add up in a way the engineers could put on paper. The county started calling it natural flood buffering in official meetings, which made Ruth smile every time she heard it, since it was just what her grandfather had always called a swamp. That same October, a group of local children helped release a small group of rescued ducklings back into the restored marsh behind Ruth's barn, watching them paddle out into the cattails while their parents took photographs from the fence line. Several years passed. Another wet season rolled through the county, heavier than most, and this time nobody watched the forecast with the same fear they'd carried before. 3 more farms along the creek had restored their own low ground by then. The county had installed natural buffers along 2 other tributaries. What used to be called wasted acreage now had a name most people in that township used. Without a second thought, the farm that held the water. One afternoon that same fall, a young girl from a family who'd moved to the township only a few years earlier stood at the edge of Ruth's marsh, watching the water move slow and quiet through the cattails. "Why didn't you ever drain this place?" she asked. Ruth knelt down beside her the way her grandfather once knelt beside a muddy 8-year-old on a Saturday morning 3 decades before, and let the girl's hand rest in the cool water. "Because not everything valuable grows in straight rows," she said. The girl didn't fully understand it, not yet. That was fine. Ruth hadn't either, not for a long time. Somewhere behind them, a frog started calling out into the evening, and then another answered it, and the marsh went on doing the work it had always done, quiet and unnoticed, the way it always had.